Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatadeshtarane Vakanda Mangalakaram Yena Vyaptam Chirachanam Tatpadam Darshitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Adwaita, Gadadhara, Srivasati Gaur, Bhakta Vrinda. Hey Krishna, Karuna Sindhu, Dinabandhu, Jagatpate, Gopesha, Gopika Kanta, Radha Kanta, Namostuke. Tapta Kanchana Gaurange, Radhe, Vrindavaneshwari, Vrishabhanu Sute Devi, Pranamami Hare Priya. Together. Apavitra Pavitro Va Sarva Avastha Gato Viva Yasmaret Pundarikaksham Sa Bhaya Vyantara Shuchihi. Whether we are pure or impure, Klishta or Aklishta, Sattvic or Rajasic or Tamasic, whatever categories you want to use, whether we're in Vidya or Avidya. The first line says, Apavitra Pavitra, whether you're pure or impure. Sarvavasta Gatopiva, in whatever condition we find ourselves in right now, each and every one of us, we're embodied because of our guna and karma, we're in some particular, we're under some particular in a particular embodiment, due to the gunas, we have a particular mind right now, which we call our personality for this particular lifetime. It's nothing other than a small pocket of samskaras that's activated for this life. That's our personality. Personality is nothing other than some tiny slither from this huge warehouse of the chitta, with all its unlimited samskaras from unlimited births. Our present situation, our present state of mind, our personality is nothing other than some tiny little slither of that has been activated for this life to bear its seed, its fruits. So whatever that is, apavitra pavitro va, if we're saints or sinners, if we're sattvic or rajasic or tamasic, if we're yogis or if we're gopis, if we're in vidya or avidya, sarvavasta. It's just the gunas. It's just a moment in the permutations of property. Our mind is nothing other than a moment, an insignificant moment in the unlimited potential of property. Our little personality is just a momentary expression of that. So whatever that might be, line 3. Yasmaret Pundarikaksha, if we remember God, the beautiful form of God, that these texts, the Bhagavata Purana, are trying to just give us a little tiny window into Sadguru Brahman, to these beautiful forms that exist in the divine realm. If we just somehow try to remember those forms as best we can, with our chittas, with our clumsy prakritic chittas, with their prakritic samskaras, if we somehow try to conjure up with those patched together an image of Krishna, the Lord with the lotus eyes, that represents somehow our version of these stories that we read, if we can fix our mind on that, or on the deity, our beloved deity, if we have a deity that is close to our heart. In India, people have very, very strong relationships with a particular deity. It may be their local village deity, it may be the deity of the town, it may be one of the big fancy, huge South Indian temples that maybe they get to visit once a year. Whatever it is, they may have a very, very strong relationship with a particular deity. And that also conjuring up a visual of that deity. That's what it means to remember God. That's one of the ways to remember God. Keep the deity, one's deity in mind. Or so this is line 3. Yasmaret. You can only remember. What does it mean to remember God? You can only remember. Memory is nothing other than samskara. So how can we remember God? We can only remember, we can only draw up samskaras. So really those samskaras are the memory, the imprint of either these stories in the Hindu tradition, stories that we've been reading, or of a deity. These are two of the most common ways. Or it could be the mantra, remembering the mantra, divine presence in the form, the mantra. So any of these various ways, line 3, if we somehow remember that, pull that up into our mind. Yasmanet pundarikaksha, line 4. Sa bhaya vyantara shuchi. Such a person then becomes pure by dint of that connection. If there is sincerity in that connection, if that memory is with love and devotion and humility, then divine presence manifests in the mind. And when that happens, one is pure inside and outside. It doesn't matter who one is. This is the beautiful thing about bhakti. The most powerful stories of bhakti are not from big scholars, or Brahmins, or the learned, or yogi virtuosi who have incredible mind control. The stories of bhakti are about low caste, uneducated, people that are normally marginalized. Some of the most powerful stories come from them, from their ecstatic love of God. That they're socially marginalized, intellectually deprived of intellectual resources because of their caste, not allowed to study the sacred text. Surdas, so many beautiful stories from the Bhakti tradition. Namadev, the tailor, he would just be in ecstasy the whole time, crying and weeping, hardly able to do his work because he's constantly thinking of the name of Ram. So if one remembers that God in his ways, then one becomes pure inside and outside. That's the mantra. Let's get back to now a more sober text, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And we read the four verses yesterday. So now we're going to, instead of consciousness, Bhakti is really, we have a clear sense of the distinction between the Yoga Sutras and what's going on in the Bhagavata Purana. Should we just recap that briefly?
Yes, please.
Bhakti is about consciousness flowing through the mind and the senses, and the mind and the senses are absorbed in thinking of the Leela. Okay? So either reading the stories, hearing the stories, chanting the stories, reciting the stories, consciousness then is flowing through the mind is absorbed, listening like we did yesterday, listening to the stories of Krishna, crawling around on his knees, bruising his knees. The mind becomes enchanted with these stories, and as the mind becomes more and more sattvic, it starts to experience complete ecstasy. Just from hearing the stories, just from even thinking about Ram. When the ego is not blocking, interfering with that, when the mind is sattvic, when the humility is there, when there is surrender to the divine in that form, the mind experiences incredible states of ecstasy, such that it breaks down. The mind breaks down. And what are symptoms of ecstasy? You start crying, your hair stands on end, you start rolling around like an epileptic fit. There's even somebody who wrote a whole book about how we're the mystics of the world, we're really all the epileptics. People misunderstood them because all their symptoms are like symptoms of epilepsy. But really what that is that the bhav, that's the consciousness, the bliss of the Atman flowing through the mind, connecting with Brahman in the form of Krishna and Rama whatever one's Ishtadeva is, could be Lord Shiva, and from that connection then, the mind experiences such bliss, it can't deal with it. It breaks down. It's like taking a transistor radio, which is used to one current, and then taking it to Europe and plugging it in, and the current is too much, so it just blows. Extra energy. So when the mind is in a state of ecstasy, when consciousness is flowing through this prophetic mind, which is so limited, and contacting Brahman in the form of the stories, of the kirtan, the japa, whatever form that takes with the deity, the mind breaks down. And then all of a sudden the body starts acting in irrational ways. Tears start pouring out of the eyes, hair starts standing on end. The Bhakti tradition says if you're not weeping when you do kirtan, you're not doing kirtan. You're still holding, your ego is still blocking, the rational mind is still blocking, what's all this about, mythology. That's not kirtan. Until you actually are weeping and crying just from hearing the name of Rama. So when you read these stories of the great bhaktas of these traditions, they're ecstatic. They're ecstatics. That's what ecstasy is. Ecstasy is a state of bliss that the body cannot really deal with, and therefore manifests these unnatural symptoms: tears and sweat, pouring sweat. Sometimes limbs become dislocated in ecstatic fits. You read the stories, the descriptions of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the 16th century, Krishna Bhakta, they're quite remarkable. He would fall into these states and nobody knew what to do with him. And his limbs would start dislocating. So these sound a little horrific to us, perhaps, but that's just because we don't have judgment. We don't know what's going on internally. We can only see them externally. And so then we think, well, that's must be epilepsis or something. So that's one type of yoga. Mind going, consciousness flowing through the mind, and mind is focused on God, Ishvara. Okay? Be that Krishna. If you're a Ram Bhakta, it's Ram. If you're a Shiva Bhakta, that is Shiva. The other type of yoga, and there's many types, I'm going to say there's just two, but what we're going to do now is the reversal of that, where consciousness is not flowing through the mind and focusing on a form of Ishvara, divine Brahman form of Ishvara, but the mind is now going to close down completely, and consciousness now is going to involute, if you will, or I'm not quite sure that's the right verb, but consciousness is going to involute and find its own nature, and discover and by finding its own nature, it finds its own nature. It consists of, what is its nature? Its nature is Sat, Chit and Ananda. Part of that nature is an inherent state of bliss, where somehow when consciousness is flowing outward through the mind in normal, not when God is the object of the mind, but just in normal consciousness, when the world is the object of consciousness, body, mind, then one somehow that bliss which is within is not accessed. So consciousness then becomes aware of the body and the mind, and it becomes aware of the sensations, of the physical sensations of the body, and the mental states of the mind, and yet somehow those are not blissful. That's not the bliss that one seeks. Those sensations of the body are temporal, they're momentary, and they don't really satisfy. Likewise, the vrittis of the mind, the emotions of the mind, the states of the mind, we seek happiness, seeking happiness through that. Somehow we never ever get it, because they're temporal, they're constantly temporal, and even when we get that little Kodak moment, we think, this is it, this is as good as it gets, it's actually not really fulfilling. And we always end up unfulfilled. So then yoga says, either you take the path of bhakti we just described. I mean, there's various other paths, I'm not saying it's just two, but what we're going to do now, in this workshop that we've discussed too, is the opposite of bhakti in some ways, closing down the body mechanism, chapter 2, Pratyahara, involuting consciousness like the tortoise, sucking in its 5 little legs. Krishna says in the Gita, think of the tortoise, having 4 legs and a head, it's got 5, he's got 5 sort of limbs. Sucking them in, right, those limbs, the head, allow it to function out there, walk around. So sucking them in and existing within an internal space. So that's a nice metaphor for the yoga, for pratyahara, the fifth limb of yoga, when consciousness is involuted, instead of flowing out, brought back in, and everything else has got it. Get out of the way, all objects, all distractions, get the body, close it down so it's not a distraction. First of all, close the world off, close the gates of the body, close them in, involute consciousness. Now, okay, now fine, now we're inside, but now we're stuck in our head, in our minds, chitters, ritty. So now that's got to be closed down as well. So that's really what meditation is. That's what classical meditation is. We close down the inner world, the noetic world, the world of the cognitive world, the conative world, if you want to use all these fancy terms. We close down the vrittis, the internal churnings, close them, still them, slowly, through practice, focusing the mind, whenever it wanders, bring it back, stillness, do the fifth limb of yoga, dharana, sixth limb of yoga, dharana, practice, dhyana, the mind becomes more and more still, seventh limb, finally samadhi, the mind is so still, it's as if it doesn't exist. If something is so still, how do you know something exists? It doesn't move. So when something is so still, it's almost as if it doesn't exist anymore, and now consciousness has no objects outside of itself. What's distracting it? Many of you do little distraction, right? So that we still haven't attained samadhi. So the mind has to be brought in a complete and utter, the complete state of stillness, and then there's nothing to detain consciousness outside of itself. So what's it going to do? What's consciousness going to do? It has to be conscious. Being not conscious is not an option, because consciousness is eternal. So you can't turn it off like an electricity. So not being conscious is not an option. So therefore there's only two options. Consciousness can either be conscious of something external to itself, but if you remove all of that, and that's what classical yoga is, you remove all objects external to consciousness, consciousness now has no choice but to be self-conscious. And that's the goal of this type of Patanjali yoga. And by becoming self-conscious then, one ceases to be aware of the world. Now, does that mean the world was false? That's a debate between Adwaita, Vedanta and Sankhya. Let's not even go there. I don't want to get too what does it matter? What both Sankhya and Adwaita Vedanta agree upon is that when you go back, when consciousness discovers itself, it becomes infinite. What's there to restrict it? What's there to restrict consciousness? Other than you take away the ego. Yes? You remove the ego, it's the ego that keeps us bounded. We know consciousness can expand and contract. Just think about if you're an ant, if we accept the principle of reincarnation for argument's sake, if you're an ant, you're conscious of the ant's body, yes? Yes? The little ant is conscious of its little body, small range of perception, whatever its range is. Ant dies and becomes an elephant. So now what's happened to consciousness? It's clearly expanded because it's now aware of a larger body. So what is it that causes, it's the same Atman, it's the same Chitta. So what's gone on? The only thing that's gone on is the asmita, the ego of the ant, has now accommodated itself to the ego of the elephant. But consciousness has been able to expand. So then take away the ego. What's to stop it expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding? Or maybe it was already expansive. Leave bracket that question. But the point is, it's the ego that has delimited it. So when ego is removed, consciousness is now omnipresent. There's nothing to... Just like light, 100-watt light bulb. If you had no restrictions, no atmospheric restrictions, the light of a modest 100-watt light bulb could pervade the whole universe. No atmospheric restrictions, no impediment. What's to stop light? Just... So consciousness is like that. So whether the world is real, it really is there, but you're not aware of it, or whether it was false all along, that's a question for the scholastics. We leave that for the scholastics. We leave that debate's been going on for 2,000 years. It ain't going anywhere fast anytime soon. Alright? So let's get back to this now. So now this is the yoga we're looking at now. This kind of yoga. Very different from the bhakti that we looked at, from the path of bhakti that we had a little glimpse of yesterday. Shasana, we did this first, and now now we're going to teach this type of yoga. What type of yoga are we going to teach? Yoga's Chitta Vritti Nirodha. The yoga the yoga that Patanjali is going to teach us, not the same as what Gita is teaching us, not the same as what Bhagavatam is teaching us, but this yoga, which is the classical kind of, Raja Yoga is only the term that the Gita uses. This yoga is actually called Jnana Yoga in the old texts. So this yoga is about Chitta Vritti Nirodha, stilling the vrittis of the mind. Stilling the permutations of thought. It's taken for granted that the world has been locked out. It's taken for granted that the body is in a state of stillness. But now the real challenge is that find that's relatively easy. It's relatively easy to, close one's eyes and kind of close out the world, block out the world. But settling in a mind, that's the challenge. So yoga then is the stilling of the states of mind. What happens then? Verse number 3. Tada drashtuhu swarupe vasthanam. Then the seer abides in its own nature. Pure consciousness now can abide in its own nature rather than what? Rather than doing what? What if it's not abiding in its own nature? What is it doing? Verse number 4. If it's not abiding in its own nature, what is it doing? 4. Vritti sarupya. It's absorbed in the vrittis. It's absorbed in the mind. It doesn't need to be absorbed in the mind. So therefore, yoga is about stilling the mind. Then verse number 5 says, okay, vrittis, there are 5 types of vrittis. Vrittayaha, panchatayaha, klishta, klishta. There are 5 kinds of vrittis, and these vrittis are either klishta or aklishta. Klishta vrittis are vrittis coming from the kleshas. Do we know what the kleshas are? Obstacles. So there are vrittis coming from a place of ignorance. What does that mean? According to Patanjali, what is ignorance? Not knowing the self. So there are vrittis that come from a place that I am body mind. Those vrittis are the ones that are klishta. They're detrimental to the body mind. When we think, I am this body mind, and we go out into the world, and we think, what shall I do today? How will I find fulfillment today? How will but we think we're body mind, and so we act in the world, and we thinking we're body mind, trying to satisfy the body mind. Those vrittis are klishta. They're coming from a place of ignorance, because we're not body mind. Those vrittis then cause seeds of karma to be planted. But when we think, well, I have to do yoga, I'm an Atman, I need to discover my real self, I need to study, I need to practice, those vrittis are aklishta. They're not coming from a place of ignorance. They're coming from a place of knowledge. I am the soul. So when we think, I'm Atman, I need to discover my true self, I need to do my practice, I need to still my mind, those are vrittis. Those thoughts are vrittis. Yes? Those are aklishta vrittis. Are we okay? So that's verse number 5. There are 5 types of vrittis, and these vrittis are either beneficial to the goal of yoga, or they're not beneficial to the goal of yoga. So some thoughts are beneficial. Eventually they all have to be still. So Patanjali then speaks about what are these 5 vrittis. What does the mind do? Verse number 6. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smriti. Smritaya in the plural. There are 5 things, 5 states of mind. According to yoga, the mind can find itself in these 5 states. When the consciousness is absorbed in the mind in which it is absorbed can find itself in one of these 5 states. Okay, so at any given moment, according to this text, we're either in a state of right knowledge, Our mind is in the state of right knowledge. So we're sitting in this room. Yes?
Yes.
And if we're seeing the room correctly, this room is reflected in our minds. And if we're seeing, okay, there's a roof, and there's pillars, and there's people, right? And our mind is presenting this, and we're hearing the sounds correctly. So there are the vrittis in our mind, if they accurately correspond to external reality, that's a state of right knowledge. Okay, we're not talking about ultimate knowledge, we're just talking about right knowledge, the first of the pramanas. Okay? These sutras are hard work. I know they're hard work. This is a workout. Listen, think of these sutras, think of them like asanas. When you first do asanas, it's hell. When you walk in off the street, remember your first asana class? Your body is used to and then all of a sudden you go in and your body all of a sudden has to do some pose that it's not used to doing. It hurts like hell. And it takes a long time to start to feel comfortable with asanas, and then you get to the point where you become addicted to them. If you don't do asana, your body is protesting. These are asanas for the intellect. They're challenging us to think about what is reality, what is the mind, what is consciousness. It's hard work. It's easy to tell us out. Just like in asana. It's really easy to tell us out, flop. It's much harder to keep the body alert, vibrant, and keep your limbs stretched and really do vigorous asanas. It takes practice. It's the same with this. If we put the work in, we get benefit from it. As the body gets benefit from asana, the mind gets benefit. When it takes the trouble, it manifests the sattva. It takes the energy to manifest the sattva, to engage with these sutras. These are wisdom sutras. They give us insight into our reality, and they help. Not necessary for the spiritual path. You don't have to be you don't have to study sutras. You can just be. One can just surrender one's ego. And one doesn't have to do any scholarship. But it is a prop. It is a tool. It is an asset in our spiritual journey. That's why these sutras are written. They're written by the sages to give us a tool, an additional tool in our toolkit as we struggle to proceed on the path of yoga.
Who said that the Raja Yoga is a royal path? Is that written by someone?
The Bhagavad Gita says that. So the term Raja Yoga is not a term that's used in all the, it just happens to be the term that the Gita uses. Even the Gita uses the term Dhyana Yoga. But the term becomes popularized by Vivekananda. In fact, he even wrote a book called Raja Yoga. And so then people think of Raja Yoga, they think of it as meditation, but actually it's just one term that just, and really what Krishna is saying is, he's saying it's the king of yogas. It's not really a name. It's not really a name, it's an adjective. It's the king of yogas. It's not really supposed to be called Raja Yoga. But the term gets plucked out of its context, and then, it's used as Raja Yoga. Okay? Yes?
What's the difference between Raja Yoga and Jnana Yoga?
There's no difference between Raja Yoga and Dhyana. You mean Jnana or Dhyana? Dhyana Yoga, Dhyana is fixing the mind. Jnana Yoga is another kind of more active process, where the mind, actually Jnana Yoga means really studying, analysis, reading, especially the Jnana Vedanta path is a Jnana Yoga path, where you study the Upanishads intensely, study the Vedanta Sutra, and absorb. The mind is absorbing all of those samskaras from the texts. So the mind is becoming filled with wisdom statements, right? And so it's being bombarded with samskaras from the scriptures, and the mind, all of these samskaras are leaving an imprint, leaving an imprint, leaving an imprint. So pretty soon it starts to create, the mind is nothing other than samskaras. So our mind is nothing other than whatever we put in. If we're listening to rock and roll all day, right? Rock and roll music all day, and then we walk in on, we're going to have those rock and roll samskaras in our mind. Then our mind is going to be sort of rajasic. It's going to be flavored by rock and roll samskaras. It's kind of we're going to see the world that way. So if we bombard our mind with Upanishad, with study, with intense study, which is the Jnana Yoga path, Jnana Yoga path, 10 study, the mind becomes saturated with the teachings of the texts, we start to see the world that way. The way we see the world, listen, here's consciousness, here's the mind. Right? Here's the world. Let's say that's the world. Here's consciousness, here's the mind. Okay? Now this mind is nothing other than samskaras coming in through the senses. So here the eyes, the ears, the nose, everything we see, we eat, we touch, we listen to, all of that is coming in, and it's leaving an imprint, leaving an imprint, leaving an imprint, leaving an imprint. If everything, and then consciousness here is flowing through that mind with all its imprints and perceiving the world. Now, if all of those imprints, these imprints coming in are rajasic, then how are we going to see the world? If I always give this example, if I get red paint and I splatter red paint on my spectacles, how am I going to see the world? Red. I have no choice. It's not a choice. Metaphysically, I'm going to see a red world. If I sprinkle green paint on my spectacles, the world will be green. So everything coming into my chitta, the music I listen to, the things I read, the TV if I watch it, the food I eat, if it's all rajasic, I'm listening to rock and roll, I'm reading, stories of love and romance, all of this, rajas, how am I going to see the world? Rajasically. I'm going to be seeking all these things in the world and never finding them. Now, if I sprinkle my chitta with Upanishadic wisdom, this is the path of Jnana Yoga. Okay? I'm listening to Shravanam, I'm listening to teachings, I'm listening to Kirtan, I'm reading, I'm studying deeply, intensely, and a big chunk of my day is spent like that, then all the samskaras going in are going to be wisdom samskaras from the text, and I keep doing this so repeatedly, and my consciousness here is flowing through these this mind full of wisdom samskaras. How is it going to see the world? It's going to start seeing the world in the way that the wisdom samskaras are directing it to see the world. It's going to start seeing the temporal nature of the world. It's going to start seeing how everything is temporary. It's going to start, which is what the Upanishads are teaching, but it's going to see it. It's not just going to be dogma stuck in one's head. Actually see the reality of those things. You see that you see the ephemeral nature of desire, that it can never fulfill, that it's momentary, that it's temporary. And so that's the path of Jnana Yoga. It's a path that involves, of course, we say reading, but actually in the old days it would be hearing, Shravana, and then Manana, then reflecting on the teachings. So you hear the wisdom, and then reflect, Manana, engaging them, applying logic to them, challenging them, probing them, that's Manana, and then Nididhyasana, which is then contemplating them. And then at a certain point there's a eureka moment, and then one action, and then actually one begins to experience Brahman. So there is this kind of eureka moment. So that's the path of Jnana Yoga.
I have a question, just on
Yes.
clarification. I noticed you were saying, because Jnana Yoga, Jhana, but you're saying like a soft G, Jnana?
There's two different words.
Can you spell that?
There's Jnana,
Yeah.
and there's Dhyana with a D.
That's
Jnana, J-N-A.
Jnana is Jnana.
Yeah, it says you spelled
I
the same word.
Spell?
Jnana or Jnana? G-Y or...
Well, it's Jnana. It's not Jnana, it's Jnana.
Some texts say J-N-A.
It is Jnana.
Yeah.
I was just,
Okay.
I was just curious because you were pronouncing it different than I heard, so I was just...
It's the one. It's one of the only words in Sanskrit that is not pronounced as it's written. Sanskrit is an incredibly phonetic language. However things are written, that's how you pronounce them. Once you know the dots and the slashes, the diacritics. There's one exception. It should be jnana. It's written jnana, but it's the only one of the. There's a couple of others, but for our purposes, it's the only exception in Sanskrit that you don't actually pronounce it as it's written, and you pronounce it with a gya, jnana. Now, if you want to get really fancy, then in different parts of India, you're going to pronounce it differently, but mostly it's jnana.
Actually,
Yes.
Yeah.
Jnana.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are different pronunciations in different parts of India.
So there's, even the written form is different.
Well, written form is going to be the same in Sanskrit, Jnan. That's standard. Or we can write it if you want. Should we get back to this? So, there are 5 vrittis. Okay? Right knowledge, sometimes the mind is in a state of right knowledge. Pramana, sometimes it's in a state of viparyaya, wrong knowledge. When the mind is not hearing something properly, not seeing something correctly, there's a vritti in the mind that doesn't correspond to external reality. Vikalpa, imagination. Sometimes the mind is in a state of imagination. Let's not go too deeply into that. Nidra, this is also a state of mind. When the mind is in a state of deep sleep. Because of tamas, the mind is in a state of deep sleep. It's kind of an absence of vrittis, deep sleep. But it is a vritti. It's a vritti in which there are other vrittis are absent. This is called nidra. And smriti. Smriti is memory. Memory is nothing other than samskara. Okay? So our mind can be in one of these 5 states at any moment. We're either walking around in a state of right knowledge, or we're walking around in a state of wrong knowledge. We're mishearing things, or misseeing things. Or we're in a state of imagination. We're imagining things. Or we're in a state of deep sleep, or we're memory. Most of the time we're in a state of memory. We're walking around remembering this happened this morning, and that happened, and we're pulling up our samskaras. A lot of the time we're in a state of memory. Dream is also memory. Dream sleep is also memory.
I'll ask you a question.
Yes?
Nidra is deep sleep, there's no vrittis involved.
But it's still a vritti which, it's not a movement, correct. But it's still considered a vritti. It's one of the 5 vrittis.
Nothingness. Nothingness is a
No,
vritti.
it's not nothingness.
Well, it isn't. It's chitta stuff.
Because if you attach EG, you'll see some waves. So from this perspective, some waves, something good.
Yeah, they would say, yoga would also say that the property is never completely still. There's always some rajas and some sattva. But in the state of nidra, it's almost still. So there are no samskaras arising because that would be dream sleep. So there is, but it's still a vritti. So you're saying it's a vritti, it's a mold. Vrit means to mold. So in some very, very sluggish, slow way, there is still movement. But there are no samskaras are being activated.
There's no consciousness.
Consciousness doesn't change. Remember that. Consciousness is always, never goes to sleep. Consciousness doesn't go to sleep. It's not that the Atman shuts down, but the Atman is absorbed in the mind, and the mind is in a state of almost complete dense blackness. So it would be like, imagine if we closed all the lights and we were in pitch blackness, closed all sound, and we stare at a black wall. And you did that for 6 hours. And then you walked away and someone said to you, well, what did you say? What are you going to say? Well, I just saw black, but you were wide awake. You were wide awake for 6 hours, wide awake, you stare at a black wall. And then you go away and someone says, well, what was all that about? What are you going to say? Black. But you were still wide awake. So Atman is not that consciousness can never not be conscious. So even in a state of deep sleep, consciousness is 100% conscious, but what is it conscious of? It's conscious of a chitta, the vritti of which is almost 100%, and you make a good point, it's still a vritti, somehow or other, it's still a vritti, it's a state, so there must be some movement. But it's almost 100% tamas.
But when the vrittis are hidden.
Well, when we say vrittis are hidden, what we mean is all the samskaras are suppressed. It's actually a state of chitta-vritti nirodha. But it's not a state of chitta-vritti nirodha that we seek in yoga, because the state of chitta-vritti nirodha we seek in yoga is pure sattva, or wide awake. where the mind is completely still but completely conscious and awake. Whereas this is a state of chitta vritti nirodha because of tamas. So consciousness is absorbed in it, it's conscious of it, it can never not be conscious. Not being conscious is not an option. Ever. Ever. For all eternity. We are eternal. If you're having a bad day, don't do it. Because consciousness is eternal. We just if when the body dies, we're just going to be conscious in some other state. So deep sleep is a state of 100% consciousness, because consciousness can never be anything other than 100%. But what is it conscious of? Pure blackness, pure dense tamas.
What about someone who's in a coma?
Yes, what is it
Same.
unconscious of the incorrect sperm then?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, it depends on whether that person, whether I don't know if there's different types of coma. From a yogic perspective, if the chitta is in a state of tamas, then there's no memory. It's like deep sleep. If that's what coma is, if a person coming out of a coma has no recollection of anything, then that would suggest that state, that comic state, from a yogic perspective, they don't talk about brains, remember? There's no discussion about brains in any of these texts. So we won't use brain language, and we're using another model. It's not the model that we're looking at now. In Yoga Sutras, we're looking at the Chitta model. According to the Chitta model, then a coma would have to correspond to a state of deep tamas. So what is yoga in Sanskrit? Everybody. Yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha. Okay? So what are the vrittis? And what are they? Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smitaya. So these are vrittis of the chitta. This is what the mind does. Chitta is a warehouse of samskaras. And the vrittis are how these samskaras manifest. Now, how do we nirodha it? The goal of yoga is to still it. Nirodha, to still the mind. How do we do that? Verse 12. What is this nirodha? So verse 12 to 16. How do we nirodha the mind? Abhyasa vairagyabhyam. There's two ways, there's two ingredients of nirodha. There's two things that we have to bring to the task of stilling the mind. One is practice, abhyasa. And the other is vairagya, detachment, viraga, to be without raga. Raga comes from rajas, to be free of desire, to start to cultivate a state of freedom of desire. And that can only come from wisdom. It's not artificial. We can't just tell ourselves, it can only come from wisdom. And what's that wisdom? That I'm not the body-mind. How do we, I'm not the body and mind. Where is desire? Where is desire located? It's not in the Atman. Desire is in the body-mind. It's just memories of things that the body-mind did that felt good. That's all desire is. It's a memory. I did this in the past, it was good. Let me do it again. So wisdom is to be aware that none of these desires is ever satisfied. They've never fulfilled me. Pursuing desires has always failed. It has always failed to give us the bliss that we seek, the desires that they may give us some momentary satisfaction, some senses feel something, tastes good, sounds good for a moment, then it's gone. And even in that moment it doesn't fulfill. So wisdom starts to be aware of this. This is viveka. This is the first noble truth of Buddhism. Is to be aware that the pursuit of desire is not satisfied, never has. And so practice then, as we cultivate that understanding, that awareness, as we become aware when we're out there chasing desires, become aware of our experience, start to be mindful. When we're running around, chasing desire, start to be mindful. Is this really what I want? Is this really doing it for me? Is this really satisfying? And when we start to become mindful, we start to realize that actually no, sarvam dukkha. It's just more frustration. It's more frustration. That's what sarvam dukkha means. Just more, it's just frustration. It's unfulfillment. So, practice then. Nirodha means to practice. What is practice? Let's look at this. Let's look at verse 13 and 14. What is practice? What does it mean to practice? What does it mean to have a practice? We say, oh, I practice. I have a practice. I do my practice. What does it mean? Verse 13. One thing it means is tatra stito yatna abhyasa. Abhyasa is the effort. It's to make an effort. An effort to do what? Tatra stito. To be situated there. Where? In a state of chitta-vritti nirodha. It takes an effort. Who has a meditation practice here? Many of us. Yes? We get in the morning, we get up in the morning, we sit down, and we have a japa, whatever it is that we have, and we fix the mind. Does the mind just naturally just say, oh, great, and sink into the object of meditation? It doesn't. Maybe in bhakti it does. Because what happens in bhakti? The mantra is divine presence, and that's so delightful, it just captures the mind. So when higher states of bhakti, the mantra, we chant the name of Krishna, we chant the name of Rama, it's so blissful, we don't want to do anything else. But other than that, and as beginners, the mind, we get up in the morning, right, we take our bath, we sit down, and we start to still our mind. It takes an effort. So abhyasa means that effort. What is that effort, actually? What is effort, metaphysically?
Training the mind.
Yeah, but from the language of the Yoga Sutras, there's nothing other than a samskara, which says, right, the Nirodha samskara. It's nothing other than a Nirodha samskara. We sit down, we try to still the mind wanders off, yes, and then that little voice in the head that says, oh, I'm going to make an effort. Mind come back to the mantra. That's the Nirodha samskara. Effort is also a samskara. It's all samskara. Everything is samskara. There's that little voice that says, make an effort, come on. So let's say we're chanting, we're doing japa. We're going, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama. Then the mind wanders up. Hare Krishna, I wonder what's for breakfast today. I wonder what we're going to have for breakfast today. Right? So we're spacing out. The mind is going off. Sometimes we can be gone for 2, 3, 4 minutes without even realizing it. And then all of a sudden, so the samskaras are activating memory. Oh, yesterday we had this for breakfast. All these are samskaras that are activating. They're capturing the mind. They're capturing consciousness. Consciousness has now gone off. Sometimes 7 minutes, right? And then this little voice comes up in the mind saying, "Hey, whoa, wait! You're over here. You should be back here." That's the Nirodha samskara. And effort is nothing other than this voice being strong enough to making an effort to pull the mind back, fix it back on the mantra, fix it back on the object of meditation. Okay? So that's what effort is. So tatra stito, verse 13, tatra stito yatana, the effort to remain situated. And don't, the mind's always going to wander. Don't get discouraged by that. Krishna says in the Gita, yato nischarati manas chanchalam astiram tatastato niyamyeta atmanyeva vasham nayet. Wherever the mind goes, Krishna's not judgmental. He doesn't say berate yourself. He doesn't say judge yourself. He just says matter of factly, wherever the mind goes, yata nischarati, wherever it goes, manas chanchalam astiram, the mind which is chanchalam, which is so fickle. It's always, we're so used to these samskaras tossing us here and there. So wherever the mind goes, due to its astiram, unstable, chanchalam, fickle nature, Krishna just says, tatas niyam yeta, just bring it back. No judgment, just tato niyam yeta, bring it back. Atmanyeva vashamnayat, just bring it back under the control of the Nirodha Samskara. Just bring it back. This is meditation. Don't judge yourself. What you don't want to do is say, oh, I can't do this. I just had an email from an old friend of mine yesterday. We were sadhus together for years in India. And we travelled around, saffron, shaved heads. And then he left. And for the last 25 years, he's been like the rest of us, buffeted around by the waves of samsara. And I just got an email yesterday from him saying, I'm trying to get back to my practices, and I just can't do it. I sit still, and I can't sit for a minute, and my mind immediately wants to do something. When we realize that it doesn't work, we just haven't found it. We haven't found that bliss. We haven't found that satisfaction that we seek. When we realize, I'm frustrated, it takes honesty to even accept that. It takes humility to even acknowledge that. When we acknowledge that, when we realize that, and when we're sick of suffering, that's what it boils down to. When we're just fed up with being frustrated all the time, then we can transfer that frustration and channel it onto enhancing our practice. Because the practice is the way that we can get beyond this mind with its unfulfilled, with its never-ending unfulfilled desires, this huge storehouse of potential desires, always never quite fully satisfied. Yoga is the way that we get beyond that mind to pure consciousness, which is where bliss lies. Okay? To do that, it takes effort. So that's verse number 13. It's not going to fall out of the sky. Anything takes effort. Anything. Right? If you want to be an athlete, it takes effort. If you want to be good at anything, it takes effort. Nothing falls out of the sky. So why should realizing the self fall out of the sky? It takes work. Guru grace is from another tradition. We're now reading the Yoga Sutras. So right here, the way to attain this consciousness is to still the mind, and that requires verse number 13. Tatra stito yatna, effort. The Guru grace, of course, is an important ingredient, especially in the Bhakti traditions. But this is kind of classical yoga. So let's move on to verse number 14. So verse number 13 tells us effort. 14. What more? Effort? What else? What are the conditions in which we apply this effort? Verse 14. Dirgha kala nairantarya satkara sevito dridha bhumihi. Practice becomes dridha bhumihi. It becomes fixed, solid. When does practice become solid? When it's performed under three conditions. Dirgha kala, for a long time. When we practice for a long time, that means for a long time means a whole lifetime. You know what for a long time means? Many lifetimes. According to the Gita, in the 6th chapter, Arjuna says, I can't do this. This is too hard. And what if I start and I don't finish? Well, then what do I get? I don't get this, I don't get that. So Krishna says to respond, he says, look, abhyasa viragi, practice. If you don't finish, next life you'll pick up again from where you left off. And he says, and through many lifetimes, then the mind slowly, through practice. So dirgha kala, verse number 14, for a long time. Today got to do this. Hey, sometimes very good excuse. Oh, I got to do some very lofty, noble thing. Practice isn't every single day like going to the bathroom. You don't say, I'm not going to go to the bathroom, I'm going to do my seva. Or, practice is every day like eating food. Because that very mind that's trying to convince you not to do it today, do it tomorrow, did it yesterday, do it tomorrow. That same mind is the cause of our problems. Why are we listening to that mind? It's telling us not today. So So this is determination. Determination, and you know where it all comes from? Do you know where it all comes from? This effort, this determination, do you know where it comes from ultimately? When we're fed up with suffering. It's very base, I'm sorry, I'd like to say with some higher, more lofty impulse, but you know what it really is? Suffering. That's why it's the first noble truth of Buddhism. Suffering. When we realize that, then, second noble truth, there's a cause, desire, third noble truth, and there is a state beyond, fourth, and then there's the path. We're not going to take the path. We're not going to do serious yoga, this kind of yoga, the application, until we're fed up with suffering. And so the place to start is really starting to be aware. Start to be aware, because we may say, oh, I'm not suffering, my life's pretty good, I have reasonable karma. So the place to start is start to be aware. Start to be aware when we're in the world, when we think we're enjoying. Be honest, is that really enjoyment? Is that the actual final grand finale? Is that what we're really seeking? So start to be aware. And as we start to become aware that really we're in a constant state of frustration. We're constantly in a state of unfulfillment. When we get fed up with being there, that being fed up has to reach a certain peak. If we're only mildly fed up, then we do a little bit of mild yoga, a little chanting, little kirtan. Go, there's a kirtan on tonight, go to the kirtan. So we do a little bit of yoga and we be a little sattva, feel a little pious, feel a little blissful, a little zappy for a while. Which is fine, I'm not putting that down. But this type of yoga, when we really, for a long time, without interruption, that kind of depth, that kind of effort, that kind of commitment, really is a byproduct of being fed up with suffering. And being fed up with suffering is a product of suffer. The two things are like a cycle. To be aware that we're suffering, we have to be sattvic. If you're really tamasic, you may not even be aware of we're suffering. Look, if you're in a state of morphine, someone sticks morphine into you, right? They could saw your arm off and you don't feel it. Because as dense tamas, you don't feel your suffering. So in a state of dense tamas, one may not even be aware of suffering. So even to be aware of suffering, that truth in and of itself requires a little sattva. So it's kind of like, where do you start? What comes first, the chicken or the egg? It's a good question. That's why people talk about Guru's grace. Where do we get that first insight? Where do we get that viveka to just make us wake up and be aware, I am suffering? Even that is, where does that viveka come from? Where does that first samskara come from? So these are all... so anyway, as our sattva increases, our awareness of suffering increases. As our awareness of suffering increases, our practice becomes deeper. As our practice deepens, then sattva increases and it feeds back. Yes? Sattva then feeds into commitment to practice. Our practice then feeds back into increasing sattva, wisdom, awareness. As our awareness increases, the practice deepens. So where does it start? That's where grace comes in. Where is our first samskara? It says, wake up, you're suffering. What does it mean, wake up? You're suffering. We're suffering, not you, me, I'm suffering more than anybody. We're suffering. Where does that insight, the first insight come from? It's got to come from somewhere. It's got to be the first spark that triggers up onto a yogic path. Even if that path takes many lifetimes, it has to have a beginning. And that's grace. That's Guru's grace. These are our gurus, the text. We have living gurus. We have saints that live among us, that they were touched by their gurus. They got something from their gurus. And they've dedicated their lives to these practices, to these teachings, and then out of compassion they do what their guru did for them. And that's open up and create opportunities for others to come in contact with the teaching, and they plant seeds. So you have a nice community here. You have Swami Sitaramananda, gave a lovely satsang this morning. Very just pure, devoted, beautiful soul. So these people touch our hearts, and that's where we get our inspiration for our spiritual practices, from our teachers. Some of our teachers write books. These are also teachers. Patanjali is our teacher. Well, Krishna is our teacher. And somehow or other, if we come in contact with these teachings and start our own spiritual journey, then this is the goal of life. And we're enormously blessed. And we can never finish. Once you start, forget about it. Once you start, you're finished. Your material life is finished. Your prakritic life is finished. Even if it takes 100 lifetimes. Pardon? Yes? You know what? There's a beautiful verse in the Krishna tradition. If you value the company of your family, the reputation in society, and if you value your attachments and your home and your possessions and what the world thinks of you, don't go down to the banks of the Yamuna River, because there you might find a little blue boy with a flute who will steal your heart away. And once Krishna steals your heart away, you can never go back. You can have little relapses. And sometimes, Raj just takes over and you go back out there. I'm going to find happiness. I don't care what anybody says. Yeah, yogis say. And you do it. It's fine. Don't judge yourself. You have a relapse. Go have a relapse. Just keep witness. Keep the mind. Keep the wisdom samskara, because you can never. Once it's there, it's never going anywhere. It's constantly going to be monitoring. And you go back and have as big a relapse as you want. Have a 10-life relapse. You're going to have a 10-life relapse. For 10 lives, take a detour. That wisdom samskara it's not like other samskaras that can be pushed into the subconscious for life, for forever. That is always going to be monitoring, and you're always going to be aware that you're suffering and that you're failing. That you're failing to find fulfillment through the mind and the senses, trying to find happiness through sensual stimulation or mental, emotional vrittis. So, once we become, the first act of viveka in the Yoga Sutras, the first time the word viveka is used is vivekanaha sarvam dukkha. The first expression of wisdom. Viveka means wisdom. The first expression of wisdom is very unglamorous. It's very, the first expression of wisdom is I am suffering. And this is why it's the first known truth of Buddhism, it's the first verse of the Sankhyakarika. So, you know what's wonderful about these texts? If you didn't have these texts telling you that was wisdom, and you were aware of suffering, you'd think you were a loser. Right? Because everybody else seems to be having a great time. And then you tell someone I'm suffering, and they say, oh, you loser, go to the doctor, whatever. So these texts are telling us, it's not only is it okay to be aware that I'm suffering, but that is a sign of wisdom. It's not a sign of being a loser, that somehow we missed the boat. Everybody else is having fun, what the hell am I doing? Sitting there chanting Om, like a loser, on a Saturday night. Everybody else is partying, I'm sitting there. So these traditions then comfort us, and that's why it's important to have community. Krishna says what is night for the yogi is day for the materialist. It's night and day. If you're all alone out there trying to practice, and everybody, all your old friends, and in fact everybody out there is running around chasing desires and trying to have a good time out in the town, and you're there trying to do yogic practice, and if you're completely isolated, you can start feeling, maybe I'm a bit weird. What's wrong with me? So community is very important. It's not in Patanjali, but there are traditions. Patanjali talks about, Kriya Yoga, various ingredients of Kriya. But some traditions stress Sangha as one of the most important parts of yoga. You've got to have community. You've got to be in the company of like-minded souls, because then you reaffirm your commitment. You're not a weirdo out there on your own. So, practice. Once we start to become aware of suffering, the depth of our practice is going to correspond to our awareness of the frustrating nature of everything else. The two go hand in hand. As long as we think there's something out there. Sarvam dukkam. What does sarvam dukkam mean? It's all frustrating. If we think alpam dukkam, some things are frustrating, but there's still a few things out there. Where are we going to direct our energy? To try and check out those things that we missed. Mostly it's suffering, but there's still a couple of things out there I know I can find fulfillment if I just move to California, if I just made little money, if I change my partner, if I do this, if I do that, if I tinker with my prakritic situation, there's still a chance. As long as we think that, our energy is going to be directed in that way. And we're going to be thinking, I still need to accomplish this, I need to accomplish that, I need to write my book, I need to read my book yet, or I haven't done this yet, or I haven't been recognized as a great teacher in this context yet, or whatever it might be. So then our energy is going to flow out towards that. It's only when sarvam, the reality of sarvam, all, sarvam, dukkha, all is frustrating. It's only when that really, not theoretically, not because we read the Noble Truths, because it's kind of a cool thing to read, but when that really dawns, when that settles deeply, when the sarvam, when the meaning of sarvam becomes, when we realize it, viveka, then our practice becomes, verse number 14, dirgha kala, for a long time, nirantarya, no interruption, and satkara sevita, we perform it with respect and gratitude, satkara, that we are just grateful that we have this raft that our teachers, our sages, our teachers have given us these means, these ways of finding, first of all, peace, and then bliss. What do I mean by that? First of all, peace and then bliss? Well, first of all, the mind has to become sattvic. And then we get peace. That's not the goal. Goal is the bliss of Atman. But that's that's a beautiful goal at the end there. But almost immediately, as we practice, as we take our practice very, very quickly, we start to appreciate, we start to experience the benefits of a peaceful mind. Sattva. And once we start to taste sattva, then rajas loses its appeal. Desires lose their appeal. And you begin to think, what the hell was I doing running around for so many years? What was I doing? I must have been in a state of insanity. That's what Maya is a state of insanity. Right? What is insanity? If we think I'm Jesus Christ, I'm insane, right? If I go around saying I'm Jesus Christ, we think I'm insane. To think we are what we're not, that's insanity. So that's what moha means, that's what maya means. Mayaha, maya, moha, it's a state of insanity. Atman has forgotten itself, and it thinks it's something else. It thinks it's this mind, with its vrittis. So therefore, yoga, this type of yoga, is about still the vrittis, still them and get an experience of something beyond the vrittis. So, this is verse 14. Let's just keep our eye on the ball. What are we doing? What's yoga? Chitti vritti nirodha. What happens when we chitta vritti nirodha? Verse 3. Drashtu svarupe vasthanam. Say it, it's beautiful. It's Sanskrit. Come on, let's say it. Everybody. Atha. Yoga. Anushasanam. Yogash. Chitta. Vritti. Nirodha. Tada. Drashtu. Swarupe. Vasthanam. Vritti sarupya. Itara. Say it as a language. Listen. This is a language. Okay, let's do a little experiment. I do this once in a while at class. Tim, I want you to ask me, what are you doing now? Wait, and I'm going to answer. We're going to do this as a conversation. This is living language. And then I want you to say, what's that? And I'm going to answer. And then I want you to say, what happens then if you did that? And I'm going to answer. And then if you would then say, if you're not doing that, then what are you doing? Ready? Everybody's got their lines? Tim, we're going to have a conversation now. Okay? Well, when I respond to you, it's not parrots, it's not words like a parrot, it's not like that. We're going to have a conversation. You're going to speak English, I'm going to speak Sanskrit.
What are you doing now?
Atta Yoganushasan.
What's that?
What's that?
Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha.
What happens when you do that?
Tada Drashtu Swarupe Vastan.
And if you're not doing that, what are you doing?
Vritti Sarupya Vitaratra. So this is, if you can memorize these sutras, by the way, this is something you can do with your mind when you're walking around, spacing out. A beautiful thing to do with the mind is memorize shlokas. If you read a shloka that really impacts you, especially from the Bhagavad Gita, memorize it. Memorize it word for word for word, so that when you're saying it, you're not just like a parrot, you know. Not like that. Actually figure out what all the words mean and then repeat it to yourself with meaning, with attention. That becomes part of your samskaric makeup. That's what Jnana Yoga is. Jnana Yoga is saturating the mind in wisdom teachings. Okay, so we're doing Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Okay, 5 vrittis. Nirodha. How do you Nirodha? Verse number 13, what do we say? What is it? To Nirodha, what do you need to do? You need to practice. And what kind of practice? What are the conditions of that practice? Verse 14? Uninterrupted. That means every day, daily practice. And in the beginning, it's good to make a vow. In the beginning, sometimes many traditions, the Guru will say, take this mantra and chant it for an hour. Or take this japa. Some traditions will say, this is japa, we'll take and do 16 rounds of this. In this way, the Guru is helping the student, because the mind's going to say, oh, I got no time today, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, oh, I'll just do 10 minutes today. So sometimes it's good for the teacher to say, okay, take a vow and do 10 of these a day. So now when the mind makes like marriage, it's a commitment. And if you're a dharmic person, you respect that commitment. So if the teacher says, okay, in order to help a person whose mind is going to say, oh, I'll just do 5 minutes today, or I'll double tomorrow, right? Mind always finding excuses not to do this. And sometimes the teacher will say, here, I want you to chant Om Namo Narayana, whatever the mantra is, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, and in order to help you to create some structure, to create sort of, to make sure that that you create this time, take the mala and do, 10 of these, Om Namo Narayana, Om Namo Narayana, whatever it is, and that way it's a commitment, it's an honor. The disciple honors the request of the Guru and does that. So some traditions actually have a formal, when you take initiation, you commit to a formal little contract, which is simply meant to help structure this mind that's going to always be finding excuses not to do practice. It sometimes help to have this sort of formal kind of commitment. So verse 14, Dirghakala, long time, Nerantarya, no interruption, Satkara Sevita, with respect. Don't get frustrated. Don't expect the mind to lie down and play dead. It's going to protest. The mind has been vrittying for unlimited births. In dog bodies, in cat bodies, in giraffe bodies. It's not going all of a sudden going to just nirodha. So therefore it's going to take time, as all good things do. Verse 15. So what is abhyasa? What is nirodha? Two things. What is it? Abhyasa, vairagya. So now we get to vairagya. What is vairagya? Verse 15. Vairagya means, in Sanskrit, it's vi-raga. Raga means desire. Vai is the same as vi. So vairagya is drishta anushravika vishaya vritishnasya vashikara sanya vairagya. Vairagya is the controlled mind. To control the mind. The controlled mind, vitrishnasya, of one who has no thirst no desire for drishta anushravika vishaya, for seen or unseen things. In other words, to slowly lose desire for sensual, losing the desire for sensual experience, pleasures. It's not that those pleasures are not there. It's not that when one doesn't eat a nice meal, one doesn't, the taste buds don't respond and don't appreciate the food. But one loses the desire. One ceases thinking, I can find fulfillment through sensual indulgence. That's Vairagya. So it is a state of viraga. What does that mean? Virajas. Raga comes from the root rajas. When the mind is in a state of rajas, what is rajas? Rajas is desire, 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 desire. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that, I've been here, I've been there. This flavor, that flavor. Right? Constant consumption, never ending. It's never ending. Why don't we realize that? Isn't it so obvious? It's so obvious. Look around. Look at our own lives. Where did it ever end? And I think of all the things we've done, all of the dreams we've chased, all of the desires we've pursued. Which one of them has ever satisfied us? Which one of them? Why isn't that obvious? We don't have to look at anybody else. Why isn't it obvious in our own lives? That whenever we chase a desire based on that this is going to make my body feel good, or this is going to make my emotional body feel good, or this is going to make my intellectual body feel good. Intellectuality is the same. Intellectuality, I'm going to read Hegel, I'm going to read Schopenhauer, I'm going to read this philosopher, that philosopher, this philosopher. Does it ever end? There's no truth there. Hegel comes out with some grand narrative, grand explanation of human, of history, and then some other philosopher comes along and criticizes him, and comes up with some other grand narrative, and on and on and on and on and on. Where does that change? Intellectuality doesn't. It's the same. It's just a subtler level of never-ending permutation. And what we seek is eternal bliss. This is eternal. Why do we seek that? Because that's what we are. Our inherent nature is eternal, conscious, and blissful. That's what we are. So when we're absorbed in that which we're not, and that which we're not is always changing. Our very nature is demanding eternal bliss. Our nature demands that because that's what it is. We have no choice. It's our constitution. It's our inherent nature. Our inherent nature is eternal bliss. So when when we're absorbed in the ever-changing, whether it's sensual, whether it's emotional, whether it's mental, whether it's intellectual, and reading Kant and Hegel, it never ends. And therefore there is never this satisfaction that we seek. And so yoga is saying, when we start to get these realizations, when we start to be aware, it starts with being aware. Start to be aware of suffering. There is no yoga path without that awareness. There is no first. That's why the Buddha put it right up there, right up. No messing around. Buddha's not a philosopher. He said 12 things. Sarvam dukkam. Everything is suffering. There's a cause. There is a state beyond it, and there's a path to get there. All of this Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, we don't even know if that goes back to the Buddha. That's all written 300 years later, all that gets compiled. Maybe it did. I'm not saying it didn't. But what we do know the Buddha said, right in his first sermon, right when he comes out of the forest, after his enlightenment experience, this, even academic scholars who are all critical and text critical, and this was written later and that gets added in, right? Spend your life figuring out. Even those scholars admit that one thing we can be sure of about what the Buddha did say is the Four Noble Truths. No messing around. Everything. And what is the first truth? Suffering. If we don't, it's not pessimistic. What's pessimistic about that? It would be pessimistic if you just say everything's suffering and there's only one truth. That would be pessimistic, right? Just full stop. All right. See you later. We'll go back to the forest. But no, there is suffering, there is a cause. And what is that cause? Desire. Desire. This is how these systems are completely subversive of our modern consumer society. What is our modern consumer society telling us? that we will find happiness through consumption, culture, right? A modern society, the premise is, right, everyone has a right to seek happiness. How do you find happiness? Through consumption, right? Doesn't matter who you vote for. Obama, whatever. What is it all about? Consume, consume, consume. How are we going to get our economy back? Consume, consume, produce, produce, produce. Why are you producing? To consume. Right? How are we going to solve all our problems? Production, production, consumption, consumption. So how do we find happiness? Through the fulfillment of desire. These traditions are saying desire is suffering. Our modern consumer culture is saying desire is happiness. This is the society we live in. Desire equals happiness. Fulfillment of desire, that's happiness. These traditions, fulfillment of desire, that's suffering. These are radically subversive paradigms. That's why you have to have community. Otherwise you're going to be the loser out there trying to do almost by yourself. When the whole society, the civilization, the ads, the TV, everything is throwing at us desire, consume, right? We watch all these fantasy movies. What's it all about? Desire. Oh, they're doing it. They're getting it. Must be out there. Look, magazine says it's there. All glossy, fake. 3 inches of makeup. It's all an illusion. So, right? Bright lights. So, so part of this then, the verse 50 is Vairagya. The lack of ragas, the wisdom to see that desire is the problem. Desire is the problem. Krishna says in the Gita, Kama Esha, Krodha Esha, Rajaguna Samudbhavaha, Mahapapam, Vitihi Enam, Airinam. Know this to be the enemy, Arjuna. What's the enemy? Not the Kauravas over there. What's the enemy? It's Kama, desire. Rajaguna Samudbhavaha, which comes from Rajas. That's Vairagya means without Rajas. Do you see the connection between Vairagya and Rajas? Raga, Rajas, same root. Vai means without in Sanskrit. So what is Vairagya? It is the Vashikara Samya, the controlled mind. There has to be some control. There has to be some attempt to control the mind. Just because it's so heavily pervaded by Rajas. So there has to be some control. That's sattva. A little bit of sattva, whatever little bit of sattva we have to cling on to that and use that sattva to try to control the Rajas. The more the sattva grows, the Rajas is going to dwindle. Something's going to take its place. The mind's got to have. It's made of gunas. Right? It's either going to be Rajas or Tamas or Sattva or some combination. So the more we increase Sattva, it can only increase if something decreases. It's just physics actually. It's metaphysics. It's like if this room is full of water, if I want to put some sand in, well I have to take some water out and then I can put something else in. So if it's to the extent that if I want to get rid of Rajas, I have to replace it with something. So that is Sattva. How do I get the Sattva in there? To minimize, and Rajas is desire. How do I get the sattva in there? Through study, through mantra, through yogic practice. The more I absorb my mind in these practices, automatically the Rajas component dwindles. What is that Rajas component? Desire, the idea that I can find happiness running around, chasing illusions. So Vairagya is this absence of raga, which is the controlled mind of one who is without thirst for drishta anushravika vishaya, for sense objects. Whether you drishta, you experience them, or anu, I've heard about them, anushravika. Okay? And what happens? Tatparam, where does that end up? Tatparam, higher than that, purusha kyate guna vaitrishna. Eventually, as one approaches the Atma, as the mind becomes more and more sattvic and starts to reflect the Atman, starts to come closer to the Atman, what happens? It loses interest in gunas, the entire world of the gunas. Become completely disinterested in the world. And how is that going to? You're only going to do that if you've replaced it with something better. And what is that something better? Purusha Kyate, an experience of the Purusha. As the mind's, you can't give up the world. Listen, the mind's we've got to have happiness. Everybody has to have happiness. Not like the yogi in the forest or some kind of weird, demented freak. Some kind of strangely, right? Everyone is seeking happiness, whether it's an ant, whether it's American Constitution, everybody is seeking happiness. The yogi is no different. The yogi is absolutely no different. He's seeking happiness, but the yogi has understood from wisdom, from sattva, happiness is not out there, it's not mind-body experience, happiness is within.